Good evening, everyone, and welcome to day 2 of our Night of Ideas. Hopefully you enjoyed yesterday and you've just been watching our movie for the night, L'Apprentissage, which was the first episode of a 3-part documentary series, Décolonisation, which is by Karim Misquet, Marc Ball and Pierre Singaravélou. So I hope you've enjoyed the movie, which really gave a perspective of colonizations through the eyes of the people colonized. So a very interesting and rich movie that was made over several years with a number of documentaries. So for the next event, which is really the debate of the night on new empires and old empires, we've got a number of guests, including one of the makers of the film, but the host of the evening tonight is Natalya Vince. She's a historian, modern and arts, contemporary Algeria, France, and reader in North African and French studies at the University of Portsmouth. So she will be hosting tonight's debate, which no doubt will be as exciting and interesting as all of the ones that we've watched yesterday. And I look forward to seeing you again Thursday and Friday. Thank you very much.
Bonsoir et bienvenue à toutes et à tous. We're delighted that you're able to join us for this panel on Old Empires and New Umpires, which brings together Professor Pierre Singaravélou, Professor Olivette Otele, and Dr. Samir Puri, 3 academics whose work has not only explored the nature of empire, colonial rule, and decolonization, but who have also engaged in the crucial question of who gets to tell these stories. So Pierre Singaravélou is a historian and a professor of contemporary history at the Sorbonne University and a British Academy Global Professor at King's College London since 2019. He's extensively published on colonialism, imperialism, and globalization. And he recently co-directed a docuseries, Décolonisations, the first episode of which you've just seen. And next year, or this year rather, in 2021, he's going to be releasing a documentary on China. Olivette Otele is Professor of the History of Slavery and Memory of Enslavement at the University of Bristol. She's a Fellow and Vice President of the Royal Historical Society. Her area of research is colonial and post-colonial history and the histories of people of African descent. Her latest books include a monograph, African European, An Untold History, and an edited volume, Post-Conflict Memorialization, Missing Memorials, Absent Bodies, both of which were published last year in 2020. So Samir Puri completed a PhD at Cambridge University in International Relations, worked at RAND and then at the Foreign Office. He became a lecturer in King's College London and in 2020, a senior fellow at Singapore's International Institute for Strategic Studies. His book, The Great Imperial Hangover, is a distillation of these following varied perspectives, from the academic to the practical, from the personal to the political, and from the descendants of the colonized to those of the colonizers. So we're going to start with just a few words about the title of this panel, Old Empires, New Umpires. And I'm going to begin just by reading the brief that we were given and that provoked us all in different ways and which we're all responding to based on our own research and own experiences. So this was the brief that we were given. A half-century of post-colonial studies has enshrined the idea that empires have essentially undermined societies around the world and left psychological scars that may never heal. Contemporary anti-imperialists construe colonial empires as historical singularities that mankind has a moral duty not to replicate. Yet, aren't we witnessing a rebirth of imperialist temptations whose raison d'etre seems more acceptable only because they're the product of new regional powers? So that's the brief that we've all been working with. It's quite a provocative one. And I'm just going to say a few words about what those words inspired in me before passing over to our speakers. So when you speak to a historian of France about old empires, it's likely to evoke for them what is often referred to as the First French Empire from the 16th to the early 19th century. These are the so-called old colonies in North and South America, the Caribbean, those dotted along the west coast of Africa, scattered across what was called French India. One might argue that some of these territories from the old empire, which were intimately connected to slavery, have today the same old empires. French Guiana, for example, continues to be French territory. The powerful first episode of the Décolonisations documentary series by Pierre, Singaravélou, Karim Misquet and Marc Ball, which we've just watched the first episode of, takes us into the second wave of European imperial expansion from the mid-19th century onwards. This formally ended with political independence for countries across Africa and Asia between the late 1940s and the 1970s. Without denying the dynamism of post-colonial societies, and whilst avoiding permanently seeing formerly colonized peoples uniquely through the lens of their relationship with the former colonizers, the legacies of these not-so-old empires live on. They live on economically, politically, socially, and culturally, and indeed, as the description of the panel indicates, perhaps even psychologically. Or as Frantz Fanon put it, writing at the height of the Algerian War of Independence in the late 1950s and early 1960s, imperialism sowed seeds of decay here and there that must be mercilessly rooted out from our land and from our minds. Already after 1945, empire and imperialism, at least in their late 19th century and early 20th century forms, were increasingly rejected by the post-1945 international community, which instead sought to embrace a more equitable language of trusteeship, development and cooperation. Many anti-colonialists would and did argue that this was old wine in new bottles, the same or similar forms of exploitation under a more politically acceptable veneer. They would argue that without economic, social and cultural liberation, formal political independence meant little. These were the same old umpires in reconfigured empires. And as the work of Samir Puri has shown on the umpires of Russia, China, India and the United States, new and reinvented empires are constantly emerging in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Empire thus constantly takes on new forms and simultaneously in public debate is seen as a fixed object, something which happened in the past, which different groups argue about, or more specifically, position themselves for or against, the anti-colonialists versus those nostalgic for empire. In thinking about how the memory of empire, colonization and decolonization are used in political debate, who are the umpires who determine what we talk about and how we do it? Beyond the language of umpires, which implies warring parties in need of a referee, what are other, perhaps more productive ways in which people engage with conflictual past? And this is a key theme which Olivette Otele has explored in her edited volume, Post-Conflict Memorialization. So in short, in the next 50 minutes, we will be engaging in empire's past and present and what it all means. And I'm delighted to welcome our panel to engage in this tall order. Just to give you an idea of how the panel is going to work, each speaker is going to speak for about 8 minutes, and then there will be a discussion amongst the speakers for 10 minutes following that. We're then going to take questions from the floor precisely for 11 minutes. So please do send in your questions after each speaker's presentation or as soon as possible during the discussion amongst speakers, and we'll answer as many as we can. And so without further ado, I'm going to pass the virtual floor over to Pierre Singaravélou. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Natalya. For having me tonight. Just a few words about my work with the filmmakers Karim Misquet and Marc Ball. As you know, today in France and in the UK, every studious high schooler or every educated citizens can reel off a list of the heroes of exploration like Christopher Columbus, Vasco da Gama, Captain James Cook, or a list of the heroes of colonization like Robert Clive, Cecil Rhodes, Frederick Lugard, or even a list of the heroes of decolonization like Clement Attlee, Franklin Roosevelt, or of course Charles de Gaulle in France. But all of them are Europeans, as though the parties most deeply implicated, the Amerindian, the Asian, and African populations had no part to play in this history, as though in the role of passive victims or powerless barbarians, they had been absent from their own history. So this imperial fiction had been debunked by several generations of researchers, of scholars all around the world, who have made it their task to restore other points of view and supply the missing parts of the common history. So the directors, Karim Misquet, Mark Ball, and myself, we just try to tell the history of colonization and decolonization by brushing history against the grain, more precisely by telling the story the right way around. That is to say, from the point of view of its main actors, the people seeking their freedom. It is therefore not a question of rewriting the history. This TV documentary series, like many studies over the past 40 years, proposes to rebalance, to simply rebalance an incomplete story. This TV series tried to summon up a more complex past than is retailed by the traditional historiographies. On the one hand, the neo-colonialist historians of the former imperial powers, and on the other hand, the nationalist historians of the former colonies. While they promote contending political options, these two historiographical views overestimate the Europeans' ability to dominate. In fact, for 50 years, the supposed omnipotence of the West was a notion welcomed both by the self-satisfied Western elites and the new rulers of the former colonies. These political elites in Europe and in the former colonies found it a useful political argument to legitimize their status and to excuse, in some cases, their derelictions. We no longer apprehend the history of empires according to an anthropomorphic conception that follows the life of empire from birth to death. This vision prevailed for a long time because historians were prisoners of colonial discourse that the colonizers brought peace to the overseas territories. This narrative has been very powerful until today because, in fact, we can say that empires have been the greatest storytellers in the history of mankind. So decolonization didn't occur between 1940 and 1960 thanks to the native nationalist bourgeoisie. From the outset, especially from the middle of the 19th century, the colonial enterprise provoked fierce resistance in Asia and Africa. The seeds of the uprising were planted at the outset. Decolonization started on the very first day of colonization. In fact, the acquisition of territories was usually a slow process, difficult, and never entirely completed. Far from corresponding to the glossy image of imperial peace, European domination was constantly challenged by activist minorities. So, brushing history against the grain, in Walter Benjamin's felicitous phrase, consists in discovering from below the capacity for action of the so-called colonized, of the anonymous women and men who decolonized the contemporary world. So we had to avoid the trap of teleology. This is not the story of a progressive and inevitable emancipation. This is not a linear history written in advance. The first episode shows the discontinuity of this political process. Indeed, it can be seen that the black intellectual, for instance, the black intellectual Antenor Firmin from Haiti, proposed the scientific antidote to racism as early as the mid-1880s. This exceptional attempt does not change the course of history, but appears fruitful for the future. Similarly, the analysis of political experiences, even if they have failed, like the Rif Republic in Morocco in the 1920s, allows us to understand how the anti-colonialist leaders of each era draw inspiration from models from the past. We wanted as well to avoid a big history, a disembodied history. That is why there are about 30 chapters in the 3 episodes of the TV series. Each chapter is based on one character, famous or anonymous. And we try to show the various forms of anti-colonialism: revolution, low-intensity warfare, mockery, cultural resistance, withdrawal from social relations with the colonizers, boycott, civil disobedience, etc. Moreover, we show how social practices can be read as resistance against intrusive colonialism, like those of sports, with the example of the Mohun Bagan football team in Bengal, literature, like the work of Kateb Yassin in Algeria, music, or as well cinema, as it was in Nigeria with Nollywood. This social history, which tried to focus on resistance from below, led us to shed light on the internal division among natives. It is not always about the simple struggle between colonizers on one side and the colonized on the other side. There are deep internal cleavage that divide indigenous societies. This explains why the phenomena of domination pre-exists colonization and survive it until today. First of all, the various historiographies in the former metropole as well as in the former colonies made invisible the presence of women among the freedom fighters. Similarly, ethnicity, religious, political, social affiliations divide decolonization activists. The colonizers tried to instrumentalize these dissensions through the divide-to-rule strategy. All these fractures persisted after the independences. So the last trap, to conclude, the last trap that we had to avoid was that of methodological nationalism. Methodological nationalism, that is to say, the intellectual pattern that conceives of the nation state, or in this case, the empire, as the sole unit of analysis, or as the container for social processes. In fact, nothing more transnational than colonial empires. Colonial powers are constantly cooperating with each other. Our film, our TV series tries to show the solidarity between African and Asian anti-colonialist activists and intellectuals living in the imperial metropolis like Paris, London, or Berlin. So for all these reasons, colonial history must be global. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pierre. Without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Olivette Otele.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me. Bonsoir à tous. So there are many ways to read the brief for this panel discussion, and I worked mainly, I do work mainly on the British Empire, and more specifically on the history of slavery and the legacies of the past in post-slavery society, including Britain, the Caribbean, and Africa. So if I were to pull out the threads that run along this panel brief, I'd say that this brief offers us the opportunity to address questions around the decolonial movement or decolonizing movement that shook South Africa in 2014 around the figure of Cecil Rhodes. However, one could argue that perhaps the whole point here is to address common, if not populist, understanding of what the decolonizing movement is and the representation of what colonial histories and empires are or were. So instead of looking at the movement as a whole, I have decided to delve into this discussion by going back to the remit of this panel. Yes, post-colonial debates drilled into post-slavery societies the facts about the violence of empires, and it would be untrue or dishonest perhaps to state that the message was consistently well received. The curricula in France and most certainly in Britain were about the benefits of empires, from roads to hospitals and other supposedly positive legacies. Might I mention that those roads and hospitals were never built for the benefit of the colonized, but to support the colonial project, to transport goods, educate a minority of colonized subjects who were to act as intermediaries and create a hierarchy that thrived on ruthless and blatant inequalities. The territories in the Bight of Biafra, supplier of African captives to the British, and known as Cameroon, were coveted by Germany in the 19th century. From the 1885 onwards, German schools set up by the colonial administration were aimed at getting rid of American schools and British schools as well. That was done by granting access to education in Cameroon and abroad to the King Douala Mangabel and his court's children. And that was done with the intention of undermining American and English authority in the region. That education, those hospitals, were never open to all colonized subjects. Yes, empire was complex and there are diverse histories to be told, but empires, and the British Empire in particular, was never settled as far as the aims were concerned. The British Empire's raison d'etre in the Atlantic, to use the term in the brief of this panel, was access to goods, to get ahead of a wealth-building industry predicated on the subjugation of colonized bodies for the benefits of England or Britain as a whole. There was little ambiguity in the testimonies from a high number of slave traders and from colonist discourses. John Pinney, merchant, plantation owners in the island of St. Kitts in the Caribbean, an inhabitant of the city of Bristol in England, tells us in his diary that he was appalled at having to resort to violence to make enslaved people work in the fields. But after all, if Britain had succeeded in subjugating those people, it was probably because God made their bodies strong enough to be put to good use in fields. So most plantation owners knew that the slave trade and slavery was horrid for enslaved people, and they constantly feared for their own lives. That is the reason, or one of the many reasons why, they were heavily armed and resorted to all forms of violence. Those stories were not taught for more than 300 years in Europe. What was taught in the last 50 years or so was indeed the alleged positive role of colonization. Things really started to change after the Conference of Durban in South Africa in 2001. Britain decided to address the question of slavery and purposely focus on the history of abolition. Until then, the story was about exploration, conquest, and the histories of great men who made the kingdom wealthy and powerful. The shift in the narrative, even after Durban, the Durban Conference, was not a big one as such, as the history of abolition was taught, but little reference was actually made about enslaved people and their own fight and resistance to slavery. The term Wilberfest or Wilberforce was used by activists when the nation decided for the bicentenary of the abolition of the slave trade to honor William Wilberforce, the Member of Parliament who indeed played a crucial role in the debate for abolition. So it wasn't about misrepresentation. Misremembering was more appropriate, or rather partial amnesia, as no mention was made about Black agency in ending subjugation, or about the reality of enslavement in plantation or in wealthy merchants' homes in England. The second point I would like to address is the notion that anti-colonial rhetoric was born after colonization, with the suggestion that it was a product of post-colonial studies. Well, anti-colonial, and I'm following up on what Pierre just said, anti-colonial rhetoric and fight for emancipation are incredibly well documented across the globe. From the Mau Mau rebellions in Kenya from the 1952 onwards, to the numerous Maroon Wars earlier on in Jamaica that resulted in the deportation of Maroons to Nova Scotia in Canada in the 1790s, there have always been people opposing the imperial project in various degrees, from enslaved to humanitarians. The third point I'd like to address is the idea of empire with a U. Historians have been for a very long time the guardians of an alleged truth about the past. For some reason, those historians were rarely, at least in European universities and in Britain in particular, from minority ethnic groups, and in the case of the history of enslavement, from African or Caribbean descent. The only contestation of that reading of empire came from activists, mostly from minority ethnic groups in Britain. Things have changed in Britain, but barely. In 2018, I became the first Black woman to be appointed professor in history, thus becoming the second Black person to be professor in history in the whole kingdom. 21st century Britain is very culturally diverse, but it's still finding it hard to be challenged over its reading of its own history, if we are to believe the lazy framing of numerous public debates about the British Empire. To conclude, I'd like to say a few things. Empires, with a U, are necessary because they have forced people to consider questions of erasure, silences, hegemonic narratives and public representations of the colonial past in urban landscapes. They have forced us to look at the blatant gaps in school curricula. Empires, with a U, are not only about the subtleties or the successes of post-colonial studies. They are about agency, resilience, narratives of resilience, grassroots organizations. They are also the product of new regional powers, from Afro-Welsh to Afro-Scottish, and from social justice warriors from all backgrounds, all of them calling for full disclosure of the histories of empires, including the history of enslavement. Empires, with a U, are about challenging the status quo, and in the last decades, there have been calls to include Black history in the curriculum in Britain. Well, what does it mean? It means actually not teaching British colonial history simply as a history of conquest, exploration, or abolition, but as a history that built strong foundations for racial and social inequalities. Racism was not born in a vacuum, and it is strongly embedded in colonization and in a misrepresentation of the legacies of the past. Empires, with a U, and descendants of subjugated bodies have the right, if not the duty, to make those demands. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Olivette, for that. And I'm going to pass straight on to Samir Puri.
Thank you very much. Now, I was inspired when starting to write The Great Imperial Hangover by my own inherited past, tracing back through the former British Empire, through East Africa and my grandparents' generation in India, and struck by a theme we've already heard discussed, which is the divergence in family stories being taught to me from the dominant narratives of the UK and certainly from my school education, which seem to spectacularly ignore the British Empire almost in its entirety. Now, I was also struck when starting to write the book by the circularity of the debate, in which there are some people, increasingly people are seeing empires as associated with exploitation and with the triumph of a winner's history over those of the formerly subjugated. I was also struck by the persistence of attitudes that associate empires with order and with stability and with bequeathing modernity, and how this circle really can't be squared because some people's attitudes are extremely strongly held. And this all came to pass in 2020 with the statue toppling that happened on both sides of the Atlantic. We'll of course remember Leopold II statues coming down in Belgium, as well as Edward Colston in the UK, but also Christopher Columbus, Robert E. Lee and others associated with the Confederacy coming down in America. I certainly felt that these battles in Western countries over the politics of historical memory, I felt they were partly stoked by the confluence of an imperial past on the one hand and a multicultural present. And they really illustrated the continuing power of imperial legacies to provoke strong knee-jerk reactions, cutting even through all of the concerns and realities of the COVID pandemic. I felt that these reactions really do belong to the complex inheritances that empires bequeath to future generations, in particular, an inheritance or a perceived inheritance of former imperial subjugation of one's parents or grandparents as having been at the wrong end of these imperial projects, versus a perceived inheritance of imperial glory and of grandparents or great-grandparents who had been involved in this large, as it would be understood in its own terms, project to diffuse modernity and to ultimately bequeath the nation state or the sovereign state to different parts of the world. Now, I felt that despite the global spread of the Black Lives Matter movement and the issues that it shines a light on, I remain convinced that focusing one's attentions primarily on the guilt of American and Western European imperialism risks myopia. I think it's better to widen one's perspective to take in other parts of the world, to take in the bigger picture of how many different past imperialisms still shape our present. And this really was brought home to me in my former career before being a writer when I worked in the British diplomatic service. My last foreign posting was to monitor the war in East Ukraine between 2014 and 15. And I mean, you'll be familiar with what happened there. But I mean, I was there in East Ukraine and I was seeing statues of Lenin being pulled down rather than statues of anything that personally I could relate to. This is, of course, not my personal history. I was also very aware that as the war in Ukraine continues to unfold, it provides strong evidence of how imperial legacies have provided Vladimir Putin's regime in Moscow some of the rocket fuel to power its own modern sense of nationalism and indeed its war in Ukraine. Taking Russian history, both Tsarist and Soviet history has presented Russia as a continent-straddling empire, feared by neighbors and rivals alike. And the Putin regime has interpreted that quite directly as a mission statement for modern Russia. But what's striking when you take a panoramic view around the world is how regimes in China and in Turkey, each in their own ways, are harking back to their own distant imperial pasts in order to inspire modern bids for regional supremacy and to provide narratives of strong rule at home. In these countries, state-sanctioned interpretations of imperial history prevail, unmoderated by counter-arguments. So the significance of imperial legacies and the uses they are put to vary quite dramatically around the world. I think grasping this can empower us to better understand the conundrums that result as the world is entering its current transition phase, as power is diffusing rapidly away from the West into other parts of the world, notably China. And this is happening regardless of who wears a sheriff's badge in Washington, DC. And Joe Biden may well last year have declared that America is back, as he did at the podium shortly after his election victory. But the world is a very changed place compared to the post-Cold War heyday of America's informal empire. So I'd certainly point out that rival attempts at informal empire building are now rife, and that countries as diverse as China, Iran, Russia, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey each have different sized ambitions, but each has a claim of its own making to regional influence, which it's backing with money, propaganda, military posturing, and in some of those cases, not all, by waging war. And I would say that competitive informal empire building is one of the key emerging stories of our age, leading, interestingly, to clumsy analogies such as between China's Belt and Road Initiative and the mercantile imperialism of the old British East India Company. Now, I don't think these analogies necessarily work intact, because the age of formal empires is ultimately over. And when I say formal empires, I mean annexation, conquest, and direct rule by an imperial metropole over whether it's colonies or territories that are being directly absorbed. That is over. The annexation of Crimea in Ukraine in 2014 is the exception that proves the rule there. What lives on are informal empires. Hence my approach in the Great Imperial Hangover to cover imperial legacies from all over the world, looking at the triumphs and tragedies of Chinese, Ottoman, Mughal, Russian, and the Western European empires. And I do this to interrogate how successfully modern nations have either harnessed or are either hobbled by their own imperial pasts. Remember that for all of the soul-searching happening in Britain, in the Netherlands, and to a certain extent in the USA about culpability in the way in which imperial inheritances have subjugated and still, to a certain extent, prejudice some ethnic minorities, there are other countries in the world where there's more of an authoritarian central rule, and the sort of the winner's history of the imperial past is being utilized to fuel a contemporary quest for authority and for dominance. And just to round off for the last sort of few moments of my comments, I just want to talk about, I'm currently based in Singapore, and my work here is much more focused on the contemporary sort of power transition to China. Certainly the clash between America's and China's rival visions of informal empires, one of the principal themes of geopolitics and current affairs of our age, in particular in the Asia-Pacific region. I'm struck by the fact that a lot of world order comprises today of clashes of rival interpretations of imperial history and of informal empire, sometimes within nations, but in this case, between nations. But just to round off on Singapore, a country that I've been living in for the last few months, I'm struck by the fact that not all post-colonial legacies are doomed for toxicity. And this is a really important thing to remind ourselves, rather than being in a position, whether British or French, and simply beating ourselves up about all the negative legacies. The world is too complex, I think, to simplify imperial legacies to being one thing rather than the other. Singapore recently marked the bicentenary of Sir Stamford Raffles' arrival in 1819, when he established a trading post for the British Empire in the Old Kingdom, Singapura. And it's interesting that immediately after independence in the 1960s, Singapore pursued an anti-colonial line that was very similar to many former colonies. But that very soon softened into a pragmatic framing of the British era as one historical chapter amongst several. And just to round off with this anecdote, in 2019, instead of tearing down the statue of Sir Stamford Raffles, the British colonizer, Singapore chose a more artful approach, which was to provoke discussions about the past. The statue was painted in such a way as to resemble the pattern of a skyscraper sitting immediately behind it, so that it basically vanished like an optical illusion if you were viewing it dead on. Interesting contrast to sort of the tearing down of the statue. And I think perhaps a way of illustrating the fact that imperial legacies and the uses they're put to and the impacts they have on present generations really vary quite dramatically all around the world and cannot be simplified to suit a contemporary political agenda. So I will round off with my comments there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Samir. Please do, we're already getting some questions coming in for the audience, so please do keep those coming in. I'm going to perhaps ask each of the panelists questions about the other panelists' presentations, and I'm sure that you've got things to say about them as well. And of course, please do come in if you'd like to ask each other questions as well. But first, perhaps a question, and perhaps I'll start by asking Olivette this question, then go on to Pierre, about something that Samir said. Samir is sort of, putting forward the argument that we need to see empire in a global context, that it's a phenomenon that existed sort of across time and place, and that we can better understand empire by seeing it in this broad sort of chronological and geographical scope. What do you think the advantages of that approach are? And what do you think might be its limitations or pitfalls in trying to understand something perhaps that is quite specific about the nature of, say, European slavery and European colonization in African Asia in the 19th and 20th century? Okay,
thank you. Well, I would agree. I would agree that we need to see them as put them into context and into perspective. I would also argue that one does not exclude the other. We could very much see how the legacies of empire are playing at home, as opposed to what they're playing in Singapore and in other places, in Nigeria, for example. In fact, in Cameroon or Nigeria, the discussions are not so much about empire at all. They're not at all about empire. They're about decolonization and contemporary issues that are at the heart of debates in the countries. So yes, perspective, but at the same time, we cannot avoid these debates. I mean, there's something unfinished that seems unfinished in Britain. And the problem is that when we talk about empire and colonization, we have to be really careful about African and Caribbean experience, the Caribbean experience, the Atlantic experience, and the Indian Ocean experience, or the Pacific experience. So the colonization didn't work the same way in those three or more places, and therefore the legacies are completely different. So yeah, I do agree as a whole. Thank you.
Pierre, did you want to follow on from that?
Yes, thank you. I agree with Olivette and Samir. We must clearly define what is a colonial empire and what is an empire. Otherwise, the categories of colonialism and empire might be dissolved. So after all, it's just the role of history to contextualize, to establish date, to periodize. And about this necessity to compare, I must admit that I have one regret about this documentary series, and that is that I have not been able to analyze extra-European colonialism, not only presenting the US colonial experience or the Japanese colonial experience, but also, for instance, the Chinese and the Vietnamese colonial empire, especially in the first part of the 19th century. Because to put it bluntly, I think that colonialism as a concept needs to be decolonized. Indeed, post-colonial studies seem to have decolonized everything but colonialism itself. Colonial studies, post-colonial studies, sorry, like European colonial scholars considered that the West has a kind of monopoly on modern colonization. For instance, for a long time, it was considered that Chinese colonialism did not exist. Maoist historiography considered that colonialism could only be a foreign import. Certainly, the word colonization is a neologism in Mandarin language, which appears at the end of the 19th century, but to designate exclusively foreign domination in Asia. So it was then considered, based on the work of the very famous American scholar John K. Fairbank, that a tributary system ordered the relations between the Middle Kingdom and the vassalized neighboring countries like Vietnam, Korea, Burma, etc. And we have to wait the end of the 1990s when one can advance with the historians Peter Perdue and Nicolas Di Cosmo in the United States, that China, at the beginning of the 19th century, and even during the 18th century and the second part of the 17th century, was a colonial empire, almost like the other early modern empire. That is to say, an empire with a mission to civilize, an empire with an universalist ideology, and an empire with a real colonial administration in Taiwan, in the Xinjiang, in Tibet.
Thank you, Pierre. I'm going to pass back to Samir and maybe bounce another question to you, Samir, because both Pierre and Olivette talked a lot about agency. And in the documentary, it's sort of written from the point of nous, as in nous, we, the colonized people. And Olivette talked a lot about agency and voice, and not just reproducing, the dynamic of the dominant and the person who is oppressed in sort of writing these histories, but also giving voice and agency. When you're doing something so big and comparative, is that something that is quite difficult to do? How do you get those sort of granular histories when you're writing a history of empire on the grand scale?
Well, the short answer is to avoid the book from being 1,000 pages and me spending 7 years working on it. By definition, what I'm doing is sort of a higher level view of these histories. But certainly the thing that's always important to bear in mind, it's not so much about winners and losers, but it's about the different psychological significance that an inheritance of past imperial oppression has from a perceived inheritance of past imperial glory. And in some respects, I'm a great believer in, we really are all the same, despite our language and cultural differences at certain points of analysis as human beings. This is a theme that you do see in Turkey in the former Ottoman Empire. You do see in Russia and the former USSR. You do see in China and parts of China that were brought into Chinese rule during the Qing dynasty in the 18th and 19th century. So there is, without trying to equalize between all of these different experiences, once you've got that basic principle that there are different imperial and post-imperial inheritances, some of the big differences I've noticed in doing that sort of big picture history is between empires that expanded through adjacency of conquest as land empires and empires that expanded through maritime conquest. This goes back to comments from both the other panelists about the importance of looking at the differences between different imperial histories. Certainly, and there's some obvious differences, which is when you have expansion through adjacency through a land empire, and this also goes to the USA, which of course are 13 colonies, inhabited quite a small chunk of the map of North America before expanding to the Pacific coast. And it's always worth remembering that Texas was conquered through annexation. and that the Mexican-American War, which is hugely significant in the formation of the USA, is why there are imperial legacies that Donald Trump could stoke in terms of build a wall with Mexico, in terms of oppression, different post-imperial inheritances. But when you look at France and Britain and the Netherlands and Belgium and others, and you see that the empires were built through a globe-straddling conquest, the nature of the inheritances to contemporary societies, both in the formerly colonized parts of the world and back in the former imperial metropolis, they're very different, I think, to some of those legacies that result from land expansion. So that's what I would say, just to round off that answer, is that you're looking for the different inheritances, but you're also looking at the different local contextual circumstances that define what those legacies mean.
Thank you so much. I mean, one of the things that really strikes me in what you're all saying is about forgetting, and forgetting or not wanting to make connections seems to be a theme that comes out of a lot of what you're saying. And Olivette, you mentioned sort of amnesia, and I think that amnesia comes out very clearly in how sort of Pierre was talking about why they made this documentary. It's to redress the balance, and the idea that this balance still needs to be redressed all these years later. These stories still need to be told. And I think there's something quite striking about that, in that actually in the 1960s and 1970s, decolonizing the curriculum was actually a major concern of intellectuals, but also ordinary people sort of across Africa and Asia. The idea of needing to sort of write different histories, not just right from the perspective of the colonizer, was something that people have been talking about for 50, 60 years. Olivette also makes the really important point that anti-colonialism isn't sort of a post-colonial phenomenon either. So why do you think we have this sort of amnesia about the fact that a lot of the conversations we're having now, we actually have already had them?
There are several reasons, I think, for this, but I think it goes back to who gets to write that history. We've got, at least as far as the history of slavery is concerned, we've got this narrative that started really right after abolition, which was a narrative of humanitarianism and abolition. And at the same time, a narrative of the celebration of the entrepreneurial skills of colonizers and slave traders that collided. So, and that narrative was taught for so many years, kind of nearly 2 centuries. And it's a case of challenging that narrative and creating new narratives that include other stories, the complexity of enslavement, that is very hard to reach in contemporary Britain. And I suppose that, with the bicentenary, that was quite blatant. With the bicentenary, there was a will to change the narrative, but to focus at the same time on the idea of multiculturalism. So how do you kind of reinforce a principle, or rather a political decision to celebrate multiculturalism and social cohesion, and at the same time tackling the stories of stories of subjugation? It was very difficult, and I think it remains difficult, and hence the gaps in the curricula, I should say, because they're different from Wales to Scotland and England. And what we see today is England, for example, kind of refusing to really talk about the what they call Black history. And you have Wales commissioning a report that I contributed to about precisely integrating that story and that narrative into the regional story of Wales. And I find it fascinating, really. Yeah.
And I'll just jump straight on that, because there's a question for you from the audience, which is a personal question about your personal reaction when Edward Colston's statue was torn down and dragged into Bristol's harbour, which perhaps is a question that you've answered before.
I have, because I've been working on Bristol for 20 years. So obviously it was shock, not horror, but rather shock, because I've come to a place where I started thinking that somehow, somewhere, Bristol has reached a dead end, and something would happen. but we still needed to talk about it. And then, you know, young people just took the matter into their own hands. And it's a story of a toppling of the statue, but there's a follow-up to that story, because just, I think, 3 days ago, those who toppled the statue were trialed. And so it's not over. It's not over yet at all. It's about the representation and who get to tell that story, and who get to kind of, well, toppled those statues. Yeah. Sorry, I think Samir had something to say after I said something. I can't remember. Did you?
Yeah, if I can just jump in with a quick follow-up. Olivette, I completely agree with you about there being something unfinished in Britain in terms of that. Every empire has a half-life after its end, and obviously there's just the next stage in that evolution. It's just in terms of the uneven way in which imperial history is taught in Britain, and sometimes the fact it's completely missed out. I mean, I've been giving this particular issue quite a lot of thought. There's no single moment of British imperial collapse. That's one of the biggest things, I think, certainly for the audience to remember. The British Empire came apart quite gradually, unlike the USSR, which collapsed in quite a seismic couple of moments. I think that is one of the big reasons as to why the former imperial metropolis was able to manage the narrative of decline in a very particular way. I mean, there was obviously India's independence, the Suez Crisis, several years later in the 50s, and then sort of the end of the African colonies. But that managed decline is something that is not sustainable when the sort of second and third generation of people who came over as British subjects through the Commonwealth, such as myself, actually have a voice themselves, because the questions are going to be asked in a way that perhaps couldn't be asked in the 1960s and 70s. But just to very quickly mention, Olivette, you mentioned the sort of Welsh review into the curriculum. I was actually asked to submit some evidence to the London-run Commission on Racial and Ethnic disparity, specifically around curriculum reform as well. And of course, the devolved authorities are moving at different speeds. And obviously, I just submitted some workable ideas. And it is really fascinating to see what sort of canvas you're working with in terms of the existing curriculum. And how it's pretty uneven, but how there's almost sort of a torrent of expectation that now can't be pushed back, simply because of the passage of generations of those who came over as British subjects. But just a final comment on that, it's actually astonishing to think that I, as sort of child of British subjects, was not even taught that my parents weren't immigrants at school, and that those in my classroom weren't taught that my parents weren't immigrants in the traditional sense of what an immigrant might be, because it happened on the basis of a promise to people from the former colonies that they could actually come to Britain. And in my family's case, because of the persecution of Asians in Uganda and the consequent fears of that might happen in newly decolonized Kenya and Tanzania. I mean, these stories are pretty essential to learn, even if you don't care that much about imperial history, only so that when you look upon your fellow citizens in the workplace or in the queue in the shop or in a bus or whatever, you understand their origin stories of their communities, the backstories, especially when these sort of ethnic minority populations in a country can be 5, 9, 10%, potentially 15, 20% in somewhere like Brussels or Paris or London, which are very multicultural. And it's no surprise, because these were former imperial capitals. All this stuff is second nature to us on this panel, and it really ought to be second nature in our society so we can move forward in a way that is, I think, practically sustainable for future generations.
And of course, those people are not minorities in the world, they're the global majority as well, right? I'm going to bounce it back to Pierre to think about maybe if you could make some sort of comparisons with the French context. So this idea of sort of new stories for new generations, and new generations actually needing these stories to make their place, politically, economically, socially, and sort of culturally in the world. Do you know at all who's been watching your documentary series, and what are some of the reactions to it then?
Yes, the TV series was a success from the audience point of view. We had 1,500,000 people behind the TV, and then more than 2 million people watch it later on the on YouTube and on the website of the Arte TV. So it was the first time this year that two TV series presented the history of decolonization in this way, with new way of thinking it, integrating the new historiographies from the subaltern studies to the connected history. So the reception from the public opinion was quite good, and what was striking was the great interest from the young generation. I think it's a new thing in France. The new interest in this question from the young people from 15 years old to 25 years old. There is a new interest for this question, and it corresponds to, in fact, new political debates on the colonial past from the beginning of the years 2000, 2005, in fact, and it's growing in France nowadays.
Thank you, Pierre. We've got two more audience questions, which I think we can just about squeeze in. So the first is a question for Samir. So you wrote that it is difficult for the USA and the EU to accept a Chinese post-imperial vision of world order, especially in losing their monopolization of the term international community. Are there alternative initiatives aimed at producing a post-Western conception of this concept of international community?
Well, it's a great question, and because I work on sort of the geopolitical consequences of the end of empire, it's striking that we are entering a phase, certainly, of great antipathy between the USA and China. That it wasn't simply a product of Donald Trump's own particular view of the world. There is a lot that the Biden administration is likely to inherit in terms of just a lack of natural consensus. The short answer to your question is no, and it springs, I think, from a conception of what political authority ought to look like. From a Chinese perspective, one-party rule is not seen in a negative way. Of course, it's seen as a way of enhancing the degree to which efficiency can be achieved in politics, and enhancing the degree to which order can be brought to the otherwise potentially chaotic world of sort of social life. And because of the pandemic, the Chinese certainly will have a wind in their sails, and being psychologically emboldened by what might be perceived as quite an efficient handling of the pandemic response, no matter that perhaps the pandemic originated from their own country. And it's very unlikely that there's going to be much give in terms of where legitimacy is understood to reside in terms of political authority going into the future. I have a slightly pessimistic view with regards to the ability to forge some kind of consensus between political systems that were built in an era of Western imperialism, and including the Americans, of course. The USA was a forward-thinking nation, but it was one that came into being in an era, the high era of Western imperialism, and Chinese political traditions, which are rooted not so much in the history of the Chinese Communist Party alone, but also in the thousands of years of history of Chinese empire that precedes it. I think there's going to be a lot of intransigence on all sides, sadly.
And that perfectly brings us on to our last question that I'm going to pass on to Olivette and Pierre, which is also about alternative political systems. So this is our last audience question. As far as I know, the empires that existed in pre-colonial Africa have all disappeared. Now that African countries exist in a post-colonial world, are there any signs of rebirth? So I think this is a question about Pan-Africanism and alternative forms of political organization to that of the nation state.
Are there signs of new birth, you say?
In terms of sort of going beyond the boundaries and forms of political organization that are inherited from colonial rule?
That's an incredibly difficult question, because Africa is as diverse as it can be, and 54 countries, and you see signs of new birth, or more recently in Ethiopia, in Rwanda, and yet you see the economic imperatives kind of squashing that new birth. And I'm not even sure that these are new birth, because just to go back to what Achille Mbembe was saying, and many others, you know, African countries are that kind of beast that is new and old, intertwined with economic imperatives. In other words, the political is completely dependent on the economics. And I'm not sure that there's any kind of clear answer that I can give to this question.
Pierre, I see you nodding in agreement.
Yes, what strikes me in recent years is precisely the reversal of the balance of power we have been witnessing. Former colonies like India, of course, are returning to the forefront of the world stage. In other terms, the empire strikes back, and in fact, the economic leverage has changed hands. And the example, of course, is the new relationship between the UK and India. From a French point of view, it's very interesting. And I think this roundtable demonstrates the extreme plasticity of the concept of empire. This is why it is so useful and so difficult to use it, because the empire became just synonymous with a system of domination. So we have to specify each time which type of empire we are talking about. Colonial empire, is it informal empire, is it tech empire, continental empire, etc.
Thank you very much. That's a really good way, I think, to end the panel with that summary. Thank you so much to our three panelists, Professor Pierre Singaravélou, Professor Olivette Otele, and Dr. Samir Puri, for their intellectually stimulating, thoughtful and thought-provoking participation. Just to give a taste of what's coming up next in the Night of Ideas. So the last two episodes of the docu-series Décolonisations is coming up, is available on the Night of Ideas website for £2, definitely worth it. And then tomorrow night on the 28th of January, we have Living with One Another at 6 p.m. And I'll just give you a brief blurb of that. So now that the UK is not a member of the European Union anymore, maybe it's time to question the European identity. Is the idea of a nation back on track, or are there new forms of social cohesion, a new sense of belonging and citizenship? Where do younger generations place their hopes? What do we mean when we say we on a political level? So lots of connections actually with tonight's panel too. So Living with One Another is at 6 p.m. and at 7:05, that's going to be followed by Speaking to Each Other. And this is described as the social fabric is being ripped apart by violent forms of intolerance. The increasing number of conflicts born of intellectual oppositions often lead to radicalization that affects us all. How can we produce a genuine debate of ideas whilst avoiding intolerance, exclusion, or ideological conformism? Is free speech still a right? And on that note, thank you very much also to our audience, also to the Institut français, and good evening, bonsoir.